where our players are ready to play our first quarterfinal matchup. On the left-hand side, you see Michael Feng representing all the Oldims around the world, trying to get Oldhim one step closer to the living legend status. And on the right-hand side, it is Jake the Baker Warburton trying to get Azalea her first ever living legend points. Of course, Azalea finding some tournament success, but not quite cracking through on that living legend leaderboard. And man, what a high-stakes scenario to try and get that first foray onto the living legend board.
Wow, starting off with the Channel Lake Frigid as well. Pretty good turn zero here from Michael Feng. Just to point out the equipment suite that we talked about. Exactly what we said, but the Iron Rod is confirmed. Those are the leg pieces for Michael Feng here. Pitching Winter's Grass down to the bottom. Surely going to arsenal off the back of that. I think that, Azalea always had the potential to be one of the powerful decks in Flesh and Blood because of pieces of equipment like Skullbone Crosswrap, just an absolute powerhouse in Flesh and Blood, but didn't have the arrows that it has now to potentially support the deck that we've seen have so much success recently.
Turn pass back to Jake the Baker. Jake coming to us from Gemini Games over in the UK, part of a play group over there called Flesh and Huds, representing their background from Huddersville out in the UK. I know a lot of folks at home watching Jake, cheering him on. Of course, the Azalea cult watching Jake, cheering him on. Maybe the most fanatical fan base in all of Flesh and Blood, those Azalea mains. They're a special breed. They've been through it, man. They've suffered.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people have hopped on the bandwagon recently and pretend to be a part of that group, but there was a lot of people playing this deck when it was not good. And I think nowadays it is one of the best decks in Flesh and Blood. That's why it's made its way to this top 8. It might have been better positioned in a different meta. But, I think that with Lexi showing up, Azalea was eventually a great pick. It's kind of that sort of layer 1, layer 2 of metagaming, and we circle back to sort of like even, potentially like a month ago where this was like one of the most powerful decks in the game. Unfortunately for Jake, he has drawn the deck that was sort of researched in response to Azalea being good. Read the glide path here for Jake.
Yeah, able to lead with a read glide path. That's going to be a Death Dealer activation to load up that drill shot in Arsenal. Playing under Channel Lake Frigid, so output is going to be reduced on this turn for sure. We did see a bottom off the read the glide path, so any flip here would be blind from Jake. And it looks like we are just going to go ahead and fire this drill shot. And we talked about arrows that could potentially be good against Oldhim. I think drill shot is very high up there. It is going to be challenging to find a way to get this drill shot to hit. It can pick up those aim counters and potentially get that piercing effect. Not an effect we see a ton in high-level competitive Flesh and Blood, but I do think one that's starting to make its influence felt with this first piercing arrow. And of course, should this hit, able to put a -1 counter on an equipment they control, that's a huge deal when you're staring down Rampart of the Ram's Head.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the drill shot is a key card for both Lexi and Azalea against these Guardian decks. And Michael's definitely not going to want to get hit by this arrow. I mean, even if they're putting a -1 counter on something like a Crater Fist, it's just a ton of value. So, despite Channel Lake Frigid being down, I think this is still an attack from Jake that's going to demand a block from Michael, potentially more cards than he would have wanted to commit it under a Channel Lake Frigid turn.
No, I agree with you. This is a nice turn from Jake, given that this is just a sort of turn 1, no setup, facing down a Channel Lake Frigid. I think this is one of the best outcomes you could have because I see in hand a Knock the Death Whistle, that Azalea specialization, of course. So Jake's setting up for a decent arsenal on the next turn as well, despite demanding some cards here from Michael Feng. And there we see our first D-react of the game. It is going to be Fate Foreseen, teaming up with Winter's Grass to get a full block on this drill shot.
Yeah, due to the breakpoint of 7, it just made sense to block with the 0 for 4 there for Michael. I do think it's important during this match to keep track of the economy of defense reactions in Michael Feng's deck. Sort of critical to his game plan of blocking out some of these large on-hit arrows that will be presented by Jake.
Couple of nice cards put to the bottom there by Jake. It was a Remorseless headed to the bottom. I want to talk about pitch stacking specifically in this matchup because one thing we haven't really discussed lately, we mentioned how Michael Feng's deck able to play that aggressive game. But fatigue always a looming threat when you're playing against Oldhim. Is there a chance that at some point Michael just shifts gears and tries to actually run Jake out of arrows? Because for a long time, That's been heralded as the Ranger weakness.
So fatigue, I think, is multifaceted in these Oldhim decks now. It is no longer sort of a hyper defensive Oldhim deck that will only block with cards, will heal with cards, and just plays a passive role the entire game. These Oldhim decks, I mean, I think he's very likely to fatigue Jake. If we do go to the endgame, Michael does become the winner. But I do think that Michael will take value trades where he can, will do 2-card 8, will pummel cards, and will do the potential 3-card 10 with Red Glacial Footsteps if that's in the board. So Oldhim, both the aggressor and defender, but I think what the thesis with a lot of these Oldhim decks is that they want to run you out of your sort of initial set of reds, your initial very, very powerful cards. And as we get down to sort of the smaller deck size, you just simply won't have the threat density that you have on the first cycle.
Yeah, an effective answer to that knock the death whistle here from Michael Feng. It is a command and conquer hitting, clearing out that arsenal.
Yeah, definitely a solid play from Michael there off the back of that Channel Lake Frigid. Firmly sort of in the lead in terms of tempo, I think, right now.
We're getting those life totals sorted for you guys. We do have Jake at 34 right now. That 40 is inaccurate. Did take the full 6 from that command and conquer.
Jake here leading off with a Seek and Destroy, also a quite powerful card in the matchup, into a Melting Point. Would not be surprised if we potentially see a Dominated Arrow off the back of this. We have a Lace with...
Yeah, I think that's a lace with frailty.
I believe so. The Lace with Blood Rot is the red one, so yeah, we do have this Drill Shot coming in for 14. It is not dominated, so Michael Feng can block.
But this is a lot of damage, and I mean, we talked about where you want to kind of assign your points. Making a 14-power drill shot, that sort of demands a lot of respect from Michael Feng, and if there's not appropriate blocks available, you're at the very minimum committing to something like your Crater Fist. But if things just don't line up all that well, you could end up with a -1 counter on your Rampart, and that could be a real game changer for Jake Warburton early on in this game.
Yeah, I'll tell you, Brian, I'd be happy to trade my blue cards for these kind of red pumps and this attack any day of the week, and I think this is actually going to be a pretty good trade for the Oldhim player. That's one of the key reasons I think you do want to dominate these arrows is Oldhim's able to trade very sort of supporting and not nearly as powerful and good cards to just block out attacks like this.
Yeah, we do see some resources used here, starting with the Crown of Seeds activation, so that Prevention Shield is live. Assume there's going to be more to follow on this turn. Looks like Michael Feng pulling forth a couple of blocks here.
Mm-hmm. Interesting to note that the Red Glacial Footsteps are in the deck for this matchup.
And they're being committed here, so that is, you know, a sizable threat. There are many of them in the Oldhim deck. Does have the Staunch Response at the ready. I believe this represents a clean block of 14 for Michael Feng, so no counter, and is even able to keep a card around. So, like you mentioned, pretty good economy on Michael's part.
I do think that Jake also was able to win a little bit from that exchange by getting the red Staunch Response. I mean, Jake, if he does know Michael's deck list here, is aware that the game doesn't really start until we're able to get past all of the Staunch Responses, because committing a large dominated arrow, you're likely to run into one of those that Michael's been sitting on Arsenal for a long time. Michael also aware that this is just absolutely critical to stopping some of Jake's bigger turns here.
Yep, and Michael just going to pass the turn back here, headed back to Jake the Baker. See what Jake wants to set up on this turn. Of course, start classic play, tick up Tunic, critical feature of competitive Flesh and Blood.
Yeah, I want to keep in mind on the following turn here with Michael, the Oldhim player, Tunic ticking up to 3. Sort of always a critical point for these Oldhim decks, because they rely so much on this Tunic to facilitate some of their most powerful turns.
Yeah, those 2-card 4s, just a completely different level of output. Even getting to those larger attacks, Tunic, it just greases the wheels, man. Everything feels good when your Tunic's on 3.
Yeah, I'm a firm believer that Oldhim uses the Tunic the most efficiently out of any Flesh and Blood hero, probably.
I buy that. Seems very reasonable to me. You're going to start things off here with a Death Dealer activation off a Pitched Rain Razors. So again, keeping track of those power cards floating to the bottom. I would say this card not as impactful as it is in Lexi. It's kind of just an instant speed pump here. But still, a fine card to see pitched in your first go-through.
Yeah, I do believe there was a Bolton shot that was pitched with that Remorseless at the first turn of the game, so it does line up quite nicely with that if we're able to get those together.
And again, no dominate here from Jake, just playing things nice and slow. Gonna go ahead, look like a inertia laced arrow on that infecting shot. So 8, couple of on hits being offered. Really, Jake looking to get to the point where can go into a turn with an arsenal, get that skullbone cross wrap effect, set up the top of the deck, and get that guaranteed dominate. In the interim, just very happy to go ahead and try and find Michael Feng with some awkward blocks, maybe get, a power card like a red staunch response away from him. That's sort of the dance we're playing right now. These are just light jabs from Jake Warburton, waiting to get to the point where we can start offering some real threats from that Azalea hero ability.
Yeah, I do wonder on the side of Michael Feng whether he's prioritizing arsenaling cards like Endless Winter or like those Glacial Footsteps, or if he's strictly going for the defense reactions. I think as his tunic gets closer, 2-3 potentially will prioritize things like Endless Winter a bit more in order to do that exchange we talked about. But an undominated arrow for 8, I think, is kind of exactly where Michael wants to be. Able to very efficiently block this here.
Yep. Classic Oldham, 2 cards, Rampart, Crown of Seeds. Completely efficient trade. Jake says, sounds good.
Yeah,
and we're going to move to Arsenal.
Michael Feng with a Sink Below in hand as well as another card, so assuming we're going to see a Titan's Fist swung here with arsenaling that defense reaction.
Yeah, let's see if Michael has the blue here. You expect so. Blue count's still very, very high for Oldham. Still Tunic at the ready. Potential for Michael Feng to go ahead and play that 5-card hand. It is just going to be a Titan's Fist for 3 here.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, and noting that blue staunch response is now going to the bottom of the deck, although not as powerful as red, still critical card in terms of these dominated arrows that might be coming out from Jake.
Yeah, and Michael Feng not having to commit too many D-react thus far in the early game.
Yep, and we'll have the insurance of that Sink Blow that is going into the arsenal right now after this turn.
And that's good. That lines up well for Michael Feng. You do know that Skullbone Crosswrap going to be active when you go back to Azalea. Much higher chance of a dominated arrow in this instance. See Jake taking the opportunity to block there. It's mostly just about hand efficiency. Not going to use that Spire Sniping anyway. May as well go ahead and get a block in. And now we see our 3rd drill shot of the game. So these rapidly being worked through for the Azalea, and that kind of starts to eliminate the possibility that this Rampart of the Ram's Head is going to be worked out of the game. Now, this one pretty apt to go to the bottom here and maybe preserved for a future turn. So it could be we'll still see Drill Shot as we come back around to second cycle. Yep, and there it heads to the bottom of the deck. Let's see what the top card is for the Baker. Is it time for our first dominated arrow? It is a battering bolt, so that's a big one coming down. Let's see how big we can make it on the back of our pump effects here. And again, if this card hits, it does have some potential. It's challenging for it to get through. Typically, if you have the defense reactions, you can deploy them. But, when it's dominated, its effect kind of takes on a second tone in a lot of ways.
Do you think there's a potential that Jake is playing a greater than 60-card deck against Oldham?
Absolutely.
Because we see the battering bolts?
Absolutely, I think that's possible. I think that's in range. And, it's interesting. We talked about Michael Feng's ability to sort of play both sides, but he does it both simultaneously. So even if this is a mid-range Oldham deck, there is still value to presenting more than 60 cards to your opponent. The fact that you can begin to, use cards on defense, not worry about squeaking out every single resource because you are playing, say, 66, maybe even as far as 69 cards. It really does open up your options a little bit as the Azalea player. Pretty soft attack here. There were a bunch of reds in hand for Jake, so we did find that battering bolt. But it's just going to be a flat 6 dominated. 2 reds pitched. So again, pitch stacking. Bottom of that deck, pretty strong for Jake. A lot of reds headed to the bottom. Good options for that second cycle.
Do you want to point out though that there's not a lot of pumps? I believe that most of them are arrows with a single copy of Rain Razors. Rain Razors pairing with that Bolton shot that has been pitched and another red arrow, a good turn in its own right. But I think Azalea is more pivoting off these sort of 2 to 3 non-attack actions to pump this thing up +10 and then get the on hit of that arrow as well. These arrows coming in by themselves should be very easy for Michael Feng to block, having access to both Crown of Seas and Rampart of the Ram's Head.
I agree with you. I think one of the things I would start considering if I was Jake, knowing what my pitch stack looks like, really getting some value out of those Snapdragon Scalers on the second cycle, trying to hold them for as long as possible. Because when you think about how the bottom of the deck is set up, it is reliant on Snapdragon Scalers to really have any significant output. You want to combine that with a one-cost arrow and Rain Razors and transition all of that into a pretty good flurry. So let's watch carefully where the Snapdragon Scalers are used in this matchup.
Yeah, Michael drawing a pair of Command and Conquers here. Does have a blue as well, I think, so likely to just see the Command and Conquer run out with another Command and Conquer arsenal. Michael not finding something to get value off of his Tunic quite yet. Not the end of the world, but I do think that if you could utilize Tunic every time it takes up to 3, that is the best case scenario. Interested to see if we see Michael arsenal that other Command and Conquer. If he takes a pummel off the top of the deck, we could see that Tunic utilized in a very effective way against Azalea.
Oh, absolutely. Still that annoying Command and Conquer coming through. This is our second Command and Conquer played. Third one we know is going to Arsenal. So that is a valuable tool taking away from Michael Feng. Not quite as impactful as it is against Lexi, where it has the opportunity to go ahead and go after 2 cards. But certainly in combination with Pummel, very threatening. And we do see a difference in Azalea's turns when played with an Arsenal going into the turn with Skullbone Crosswrap available, and Azalea's turn without that arsenal available. So, just kind of a good check on Azalea's output for Michael Feng with this Command and Conquer. It's not hard to see why Azalea has sort of rapidly raised to the top of the metagame. When you think about just the value, the power of this equipment suite, the bow, the quiver, these are powerful flesh and blood cards. We see Skullbone Crosswrap is one of the best cards in the game. I know your podcast partner, Hayden Dale, long been a supporter of Skullbone Crosswrap, and you do see its effect on the game, particularly in conjunction with something like Spire Sniping here. Going to go ahead and look at 2 cards, decide how to sort them out.
Yeah, I think manipulating the top of the deck is quite key for Azalea. I don't, in Constructed, you're not going to see too many blind Azaleas at any point in the game. And that's due to having access to things like Skullbone Crosswrap, Spire Sniping, as well as potentially other effects that allow you to manipulate the top of that deck.
Yeah, and we talk a lot about upgraded arrows for Azalea and how that's changed things, upgraded pumps and how that's changed things. But I think Spire Sniping might actually be the most important card that Azalea has picked up. Just such a critical consistency piece for Azalea, built into the resource base just over and over, able to get value out of that. And now we see a bit of a shift here from Jake Warburton, maybe looking to get a little wide on the back of that Enlightened Strike. Going to go ahead, pop that one off. Let's see what the mode is. I could see, 7 is the choice here. So just offering a breakpoint. Going to be content going into the next turn with an Arsenal. That tells me probably no arrows amongst those top 2 cards that were revealed to the Spire Sniping.
Yeah.
Spire Sniping.
Michael potentially having access to an Ice React here to put that card in Jake's hand on the top of the deck and prevent the Arsenal.
Michael Feng considering the blocks here. Breakpoints are an interesting thing against Oldham. Against most of the decks in Flesh and Blood, you want to offer those 4s, those 7s, those awkward numbers. Against Oldham, that's just a lot of business as usual. There's plenty of ways to go about finding defense value, and there you see the Rampart plus Tunic combination means that the 7 breakpoint cleanly answered by a 2-card block here from Michael Feng.
I think Michael Feng has also told Jake that he does not currently have the pummel as well with that Tunic block.
Yeah, and you could just see another value turn here, maybe deploying that Command and Conquer from Arsenal, and there we go. More disruption, more asking Jake for cards, demanding cards either from hand or Arsenal, and that means Jake is not able to play effective turns early in this game.
Absolutely. The third Command and Conquer here for Michael Feng, so something to keep in mind. But I do definitely agree with the Fendel Spring Tunic for the Rampart of the Ram's Head. Get that Fendel's Tunics ticking back up for one to just get more value. It's going to be a long game, and if you're squeaking out maybe 4 to 5 resources off your tunic with your opponent maybe squeaking out 1 to 2 because of the inefficiency of its use, I think that you're potentially ahead in that game.
Yeah, and I'll tell you folks, if you love Flesh and Blood and you're hoping for as much Flesh and Blood as possible, you are rooting for Michael Feng today. He's the one in this bracket who really has the ability to extend games, make things go nice and long. And that will be his plan throughout. Defend, defend, defend. Pick your spots. Be patient. The best Oldham players are the most patient Oldham players, I find.
Yeah, I think in general, Oldham is trading a lower card quality for a higher card quality on the opponent in the first cycle of the deck, and then as we move to second cycle, Oldham can usually outvalue other decks. We have seen Michael take the value trades where he can. There has been a lot of defending, but also has been attacking with command and card, forcing cards from hand, and I think we'll soon see these 2 card 8s off these 4 costed attacks. There's another Spire Siping for Jake.
And a great time for it as well. You know, we talk about the need to not play blind flips as Azalea. This Tunic, activate Death Dealer, put Inspire Sniping, really setting Jake up to preserve a nice turn in the face of that Command and Conquer. Looking at the top 2 cards, I think we're looking at one Rain Razors possibly as one of the cards. I can't quite make out the other one. I could even be off on the Rain Razors. It's tough to see as they are leaning right now.
I do also think it is a Rain Razors, but looks like it's going to be on top in the same order for Jake here.
And let's see if he's able to find that first huge dominated arrow. I call them kind of the hallmark arrows for Azalea. Pump, pump, pump. Dominated arrow. It's how you make your bread and butter.
Premeditate, a great addition to this Azalea deck, leading with a Ravenous Rabble. We're going to flip the top of the deck. It is going to be an affecting shot for Jake.
Yeah, nice turn here. Getting a little wide as well. 2 attacks in a turn. Potential for this arrow to be dominated. Still potential to buff that up a bit. So a lot of threat here to Michael. Let's see what the blocks are. Going to be looking to be resource efficient here. Probably Crown plus Rampart being deployed on this turn is the best optimization of Michael's resources. Maybe find some other defense value in other places. There you see the Rampart pulled forward.
I've been assuming that we're going to see Michael activate Crown of Seas at some point in this turn as well to utilize that resource that is floating now. That's what Oldham does so well with this Rampart of the Ram's Head. You know, has 2 targets for these resources that they're using on the opponent's turn.
Yeah, the other option is that there's just a staunch response
True.
in Arsenal, which is a very clean use of resources and lines up very well when your opponent is kind of face up. You know they're coming with that dominated arrow at some point.
Mm-hmm.
There you
There's
see.
an affecting shot coming here. So.
Yep, Azalea activation is going to put that infecting shot into Arsenal. Crow's Nest being indicated. That is going to go ahead and be activated, putting in an aim counter.
That is the one of Boulder Trap in the deck as well that has been pitched.
Yeah, a lot of options for these Rangers now. Certainly a wealth of riches coming alongside Outsiders. Adding some defense reactions of their own to the mix.
So infecting shot coming in for 12 here with additional on-hit triggers. Surely a must block for Michael Feng. I think we're going to see this Crown of Seeds activated to recycle the arsenal and draw a card off the top of the deck.
Okay, but if you're Jake, that's a win for you. You're pretty happy to see that. That means that it's not staunch response coming out of the arsenal, and that means I expect these this huge dominated arrow to come through, and that means a lot. That means Blood Rot Pox on the next turn. It means potentially getting that Ponder token, having an arsenal going into the next turn. So a huge win here for Jake. Maybe the first big win of this particular game.
Mm-hmm. Michael able to buff that Rampart of the Ram's Head due to the Ravenous Rabble that was played earlier on the combat chain. But he's going to get this Blood Art Pox token. Ponder created for Jake.
So for fans of Jake the Baker, first big win for Jake in this matchup. Able to go ahead, sees a little bit of that critical tempo, that ubiquitous term that nobody can define. Ponder token going to go off, put a card in Arsenal. You don't care what it is. It just means you get to play your next turn with Skullbone Crosswrap. That's what matters if you're in Jake's seat.
Michael Feng with Pulverize in hand as well as a blue here.
I want to talk about that one-off Boulder Trap that we saw out of Jake Warburton. This was kind of the tech into Oldham's for a little while. I saw a lot of Rangers getting real excited about this. Boulder Trap reads when this defends an attack with power greater than its base, you put a -1 counter on an equipment attacking hero controls. Oldham very reliably pushing that Titan's Fist to 4. And that is an attack with power greater than its base. That means when this Boulder Trap is put in front of a Titan's Fist, you are able to put that -1 counter on a Rampart of the Ram's Head. Michael Feng going to have to pay attention to where that Boulder Trap is in the pitch stack. Think about when that Titan's Fist is going to be available. Players with access to deck lists knows it's a little clear right now. And maybe that's why we saw some hesitancy from Michael Feng to really lean on Titan's Fist in the earlier turns. Maybe knows he's got a green light now for a few turns to go ahead and get in there with those 4 power attacks.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. To be able to play around that Boulder Trap now, know it's very, very far away from sort of being a threat again. And we do see a red in the ledger here, sort of a key card for Azalea, but usually in the more aggressive matchups. Still a well-costed arrow for Jake. We do see a melting point played as the pump.
Yeah, nice looking turn coming together for Jake here.
This
as the dominated arrow.
So what we talked about to start, right, is sort of sequencing these turns back to back to back to really put the pressure on Michael Feng. I think when they're really spaced out, Michael Feng is able to also go on the offense and just generate a lot of value. But when Michael's forced to be completely on the defense, I don't think this Oldham deck functions quite as well.
100%. And this is all, it's a bit of a snowball, right? On the last turn, we saw that Premeditate be able to create a Ponder token. That meant there was an Arsenal on this turn, which meant you didn't have to blind flip, which meant another dominated arrow. And if you're in Jake's seat, you want to keep this rolling. You're hoping for another hit here on this dominated arrow, get a little bit of value out of that red in the ledger. As you mentioned, not at its strongest against someone like Michael Feng and his Oldham, but still a nice little on hit to have going. Also going to be backed up, I believe, by a Frailty token. Again, not at its strongest against Oldham, but it's all about just being annoying, getting through, pushing a little bit of damage if you're in Jake the Baker's seat.
Yeah, Michael Feng at 33 here, which I know seems like a lot of life, but we do have to try to get Michael Feng to 0, so on-hit damage is pretty good for me if I'm in the Azalea seat. And I think that, Michael Feng not getting enough room to draw into his defense reactions because of how these turns have been sequenced by Jake is very critical to Azalea actually getting Oldham down low enough to potentially try to actually close out the game. You can see the Azalea deck can have trouble if it's not able to do this, to just whittle that Oldham's life total down, and I think most importantly, stop the Oldham player from actually being aggressive.
Yeah, and I think, again, another win on Jake's turn is able to get that Oldham activation, so another key tool to go ahead and interact with this dominated damage that Azalea offers, but is going to go ahead and leak 5 damage here is Michael Feng, picks up that Frailty token, and Jake critically going into the next turn with an Arsenal. If Jake is able to do this again, turn after turn after turn, you see that life total start trickling down. You see Michael Feng start to get a little bit more uncomfortable. Really wants to find some defensive setup, particularly defense reaction in the Arsenal. Staunch response in particular is what Michael Feng is just begging for. Totally different game if he's able to get that safety of the staunch response. And in this case, it's not going to be there because there is going to be
East draw.
Yeah, East strike draw. So we are going to have access to an Arsenal. That makes perfect sense for Michael Feng. Really critical that Oldham maintains that on a turn-to-turn basis.
Yep, threat of activation on Crown of Seas. Just, absolute value engine for Oldham.
It's one of the reasons the inertia token's so powerful in this matchup. When you're able to deny Oldham that Arsenal time after time, it can start to, again, snowball. Azalea, a very snowbally approach to Flesh and Blood.
Yeah, I think Michael Feng, one thing to keep in mind is teammates with Brody Spurlock, a player who had a lot of success on Azalea over the past month and ultimately switched off. So I would assume Michael Feng does have a very solid game plan or at least approach to this matchup.
Yeah, you wonder if maybe losing to Michael Feng repeatedly could have been the straw that broke Brody Spurlock's back and ultimately led him to take on that new Ranger, the new hotness in Lexi. But Jake Warburton proving Azalea still has some tricks up her sleeve, an ace in the hole, if you will, and still a force to be reckoned with in this metagame.
Absolutely. And I think that Jake, really having a pivot turn over the past 2 here, contrary to sort of the start of the game where Michael was sitting above 35 health, kind of just defense reaction after defense reaction. Right now, Michael's hand is being stressed. He is actually, needing to look for those defense reactions quickly to potentially deal with more of these large dominate attacks. We see release attention the leadoff here for Jake into a Bolton shot. Will have go again due to being having a higher attack than its original.
Yeah, great. Finding a way for Jake to get wide here and, offer multiple points of threat. And this Bolton shot is threatening. It potentially leads to a dominated arrow as the next play, should that reload be available.
Yep, and if Jake does break the combat chain, Michael Feng will be able to get another point of value onto that ram part of the ram's head.
Yeah, and it seems likely. We focus a lot on Rampart of the Ram's Head sort of getting up to this combat chain abusing nonsense against decks like Dash, but it's very real against Azalea too. That Rampart of the Ram's Head often finding blocks for 2 in this matchup.
Yeah, we can see Michael Feng liberally sort of deploying that blue staunch response there in defense. Ravenous Rabble pitched for Jake.
Does have an arsenal at the ready here. Looks like another threatening arrow in the form of Bolton shot, getting a little wide here. That one is going to be carrying the threat of inertia alongside it. Also a breakpoint. So what does Michael Feng have available here? We do know going to have access to that Rampart of the Ram's Head, at least on 1, possibly on 2, should he want it. Does have Crown of Seeds at the ready. Of course, Oldham defense reaction. So many options available for Michael Feng on the defensive side here.
Crown of Seeds with Tunic as well, so able to really generate another card in hand and get a lot of value off that Tunic if Michael Feng does feel pressured this turn. I think that Michael Feng's usage of Tunic on this turn is actually going to be very telling for what he potentially has in hand to crack back with following Jake's turn here.
Yeah, maybe it's time to threaten an on-hit of his own for Michael Feng. Looks like last card in hand is a pretty good one, Brendan. One that I actually just got some time to read yesterday. It's Codex of Frailty. And that's sort of another big salvo that we haven't seen from Jake yet. It is going to be another one of those staunch responses deployed here. There you see the Codex of Frailty coming down, getting max value here, catching Michael Feng with an arsenal. Did not activate Crown of Seeds on this turn, pretty critically, in fact. And this means that Jake is going to be free to go ahead and get a 0-cost arrow to close out this chain, as well as having a ponder on the next turn. I expect we'll see Drill Shot come through one more time for Jake.
Yeah, absolutely. Big turn from Jake here with the double Bolton shots. Michael Feng deploying 2 staunch responses, 1 blue and 1 red. I mean, despite, Michael Feng probably gonna take some damage here and maybe an on-hit effect, but Michael Feng seems quite lucky to have found those defense reactions on this turn in the first place, dodging multiple on-hit effects. We do see Crown of Seeds activated.
Yeah, 1 resource still critically floating, and I think this is a huge deal for Michael Feng. This gives the opportunity to draw into a defensive card. The worst draw here, I think, would be Staunch Response, funnily enough, but it is just a red card going to be committed to the block, protecting from that -1 counter.
Yep, very solid play from Michael Feng defending out that turn. There was a lot of really nasty on-hit effects there. I do think that Michael Feng kind of drew the cards when he needed to, but ultimately sequenced it perfectly to dodge the most critical on-hit effects, one being the inertia token, and one being that drill shot.
Yeah, Flesh and Blood, notoriously lower variance game, but there are moments of variance, and you saw something like that draw off the top for Michael Feng. That could have been the moment we talked about for a very long time if that was an unplayable card in Michael Feng's hand. Just catching that -1 counter could have been outcome determinative, but a sigh of relief as Michael Feng did find a clean block there, avoids the counter of the drill shot. Pretty big turn here from Jake, though. There's no arsenal available for Michael Feng. Jake did go into this turn with an arsenal, has the Skullbone Crosswrap activation, has Ravenous Rabble set up. So a lot of potential here for Jake to, again, keep the snowball rolling. We've seen multiple turns in a row now for Jake. He found that first salvo, and things have been going pretty well since then. Not a huge life total deficit for Michael Feng, but things feel firmly on Jake's side at the moment.
I think when you're playing a more aggressive-oriented deck into Oldhim, you will find that one of the most important things to do is to create windows by tempoing the Oldhim off of that Arsenal card, because it really lowers the defensive output on the following turn. So like we talked about, doing these powerful turns into powerful turns, now we see Michael Feng just have significantly less defensive tools to work with on this turn, and potentially is going to get hit by something like a drill shot.
Yeah, and the Baker maybe looking to cook a little bit here. There is the possibility of a very wide turn for Jake. Finds a clean block, does Michael Feng. Death Dealer going to be activated. That means that Melting Point's going to be picked up off the top of the deck as Arsenal is loaded. Deadeye the pitch here. We do see an infected shot coming down. That's going to draw the melting point. And I think I see an enlightened strike in hand, so we do have options to go even wider and then maybe try and get through with those last point of damage on that on-hit arrow. And maybe I misspoke. That may actually be an inertia arrow. And if that's the case, if that's sedation shot, that could lead to some really good things on this next turn for Jake. Again, denying Arsenal on back-to-back turns. That's quite a win.
Lace with Blood Rot really nice here with Michael Feng not having access to the arsenal.
Yeah, I think we're unlikely to see a dominated arrow on this turn, but we might see a large one. There's the melting point coming down. So we're +7 thus far. Activate Tunic and fire off that arrow. I think we're looking at a big 12 here. And with a card already used by Michael Feng, it's going to take some wizardry to find good blocks here without giving up a piece of equipment. Of course, that Rampart is at the ready. 1 block, able to be committed. I think I see 2 3 blocks and a sink below. So doing some math, that looks like 11, and finds the Iron Rot to go ahead and block for 12 on this turn if giving up the entire hand, but is instead going to choose Arsenal priority, I believe. Now we go ahead and get the sink below. Perfect.
Yeah.
So finds a block for 12, does Michael Feng. No damage going to leak, but back in the same position on the next turn. No Arsenal. Jake Warburton with an Arsenal, although threats slowly being whittled out of the deck for Jake. No Tunic resource on this turn, so a slight improvement of position for Michael Feng as we go into this turn, although maybe a critical salvo and getting that first piece of defensive equipment from Michael.
Yeah, we see the power of Iron Rod equipment against some of these more aggressive decks. You're simply just using a lot of those floating resources to either deploy the staunch responses, activate the Crown of Seeds, activate Rampart multiple times on a combat chain that is broken, that this Iron Rod can just come in clutch, which I believe it did there.
100%. Looks like it increased the tension on top of deck for Jake, so no arrow readily available. E-Strike in the arsenal. And I think we might just see another big turn here from Jake, something like E-Strike, get go again, draw that, release the tension. And maybe we haven't said enough about release the tension in this matchup, Brendan. Do you think that's an important tool for Jake to be able to go ahead and utilize against this Oldham deck?
I do think that it is a good card for the matchup. Maybe in this situation in particular, because Michael Feng doesn't have the arsenal, hasn't been sitting on it. Most likely, it doesn't have access to the red staunch response. That I think that is less impactful. But 0 for 3, just a great pump for Azalea here. I think that in this situation, you might like something more like Lace with Blood Rot, right? Having the on hit trigger of giving the additional 2 damage. But, I mean, just a great pump for Azalea. We do see premeditate run out here to start the chain link.
Yeah, a lot of good pumps for Azalea these days. Sort of reach that critical mass of pumps, threats, all the pieces coming together for Azalea, post-outsiders.
Yep, threatening to generate that Ponder token. I think that Michael Feng has to be kind of careful with how he blocks this, because the attack after it could have a much nastier on-hit trigger than a Ponder token.
Yeah, I'm expecting big numbers on this turn from Jake.
See a knock the death whistle in the hand for Jake as well.
Okay. Very interesting.
Yeah, I do think that Michael Feng might take a little bit of damage from this E-Strike just to sort of ensure himself against an attack that, like a infecting shot or something of that nature, that has a much worse on-hit trigger than a Ponder token.
Yeah, that Ponder token feels like almost a certainty as we go through this turn. Just the way, if you don't have access to an arsenal, it's going to be very hard for Oldham to keep up with Azalea's offensive output on a turn-to-turn basis. You expect something is going to hit on this turn. You're not going to find perfect blocks. So maybe it is time to just go ahead and accept some damage from...
Okay, Michael Feng is going to block with the Rampart of the Ram's Head, keeping up 2 resources for the staunch response that is in hand.
Yep. Yeah, and if...
Taking 1 damage, so taking the on-hit trigger, which we talked about, right? Michael Feng not needing to overcommit to stop this Ponder token. Wants to keep the staunch response up for something like an infecting shot or just a generic on-hit trigger that's a lot worse than a Ponder token. So we see knock the death whistle pitch, and we see Remorseless now in Arsenal.
Yeah, and that is going to go ahead and draw that release the tension, and with the Ponder token available, we expect this will be applied to the Remorseless, and maybe that means our next turn is played under Remorseless Threat, but with
Oh, wow.
very few cards in hand, I don't think that'll be a huge deal for Michael Feng.
This is a huge. Yeah. So we do see the staunch response deployed.
Yeah, and that was from hand, so not affected.
Is the remorseless condition also from Arsenal?
Let's double check on Remorseless. Remorseless is put into your arsenal face up. Until end of turns, it gains defense reactions can't be played from Arsenal.
Yep, so both of them
Changeling.
being from Arsenal. Yeah, Remorseless being a card that is so impactful in some of these aggressive matchups that it's easy to forget that sort of prefix of text and its nuances in regards to how the defense reactions can actually be played. So Michael Feng able to actually deploy the Staunch Response, which is quite good for him. I think the Staunch Response is a very, very good draw for Michael Feng on that turn, going from 4-card hand to 4-card hand after being tempoed off of the Arsenal. So Michael Feng definitely getting a little bit having some favorable draws here in this mid game against Jake.
Yeah, I do want to note, I believe this is either the third or fourth turn in a row that Michael Feng has played without an arsenal. And if you're in the Azalea seat, you're very happy to see that. And pretty critically at this moment, Codex of Frailty shows up. And it's interesting, sort of the free roll version of Codex of Frailty is your opponent has an arsenal, doesn't really get to do much, and you get to benefit from it. There is, however, merit to the fact that when you use that Codex of Frailty, opponents have to discard to go ahead and get that ability, and it's not optional. This means a card is going to come out of Michael Feng's hand here. And that could be another big deal if you're Jake Warburton, but it looks like instead we are just going to go ahead and throw that Codex to the bottom, maybe wait for a more favorable spot.
Yeah, Laced with Bloodrot potentially very, very nice on this turn as well. Michael Feng, again, just stuck on the 4-card hand. The economy of staunch responses is dwindling turn by turn here. It is a bit hard for me to see the colors. I'm not sure if the last staunch response was a yellow or a red, but we do see the Lace with Bloodrot run out here by Jake.
Yes, we're unlikely to see Dominate on this turn, but we are trying to put together a sizable arrow.
It's going to be a bolt and shot, battering bolt pitched.
Yeah, looking to get a little wide on this turn is Jake, and that's totally acceptable as well. Another way to pressure this Oldhim, especially when they do not have an arsenal. Bolton shot further pumped by this Lace, and now this Bolton shot, already a threatening card, really demanding a block here. It is going to be coming through 4-9 with a couple of on-hits tied onto it. It's like a second copy of Codex in hand, and maybe a Rain Razors perhaps for Jake, if I saw that right.
Ooh, the Rain Razors, yeah, I mean, we do have a couple on-hit triggers here. Potentially, if this hits, I think Michael Feng is unlikely to be on the defense reaction. So to have an efficient block. And Jake probably knows that going from 4-card hand to 4-card hand. Jake is very much in the driver's seat as the Azalea player right now. Michael Feng just wanted to get back to sort of that comfortable Oldhim board state where you're playing with the arsenal, activating Crown of Seas, potentially dropping down channeling Frigids, and then attacking when possible. Getting Jake down to a life total where you force Jake to commit cards to hand to actually interact with you and act fatigue faster if that is the primary game plan here.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure on that Rain Razors read. It is always a challenge to spot these cards as they're quickly shuffled in front. So we'll track that. I do think there's another Codex of Frailty in hand for Jake in this instance, so maybe looking to get some value out of that. That power card still very much present in the deck at this moment. We saw one just put to the bottom, second copy in Jake's hand, so those represent spike turns for Azalea. It is a card that has pushed Azalea very much to the forefront of the metagame, has had a lot to do with Lexi's success, is quite powerful. So here is a block 4-9 from Michael Feng.
I think Michael Feng a little bit priced into this block, but we did see a lot of consideration from Michael Feng, just wondering what the potential next attack might be, what sort of nasty on-hit triggers he might be facing. We do see Codex of Inertia come out, so Ponder token generated.
That's a Frailty Codex, right, Brennan?
Sorry, Codex of Frailty.
You know, some of these decks do play the 6 codexes. Jake is not one of them, but I have seen that as tech against Oldhims, usually on the part of Lexi's. But it is going to be Drill Shot coming through for 7, and there's no blocks here from Michael Feng, and that means it's time for that -1 counter That's going to go through on that Rampart, and a critical resource lost by Michael Feng on this turn. Huge, huge win for Jake Warburton. Also going to go into the next turn with that Ponder token. And I'm going to do some quick math, Brendan. Let me sort it out. 362 points of value on that Codex of Frailty. Incredible output and a huge swing in this game from Jake Warburton.
Yeah, I think that's why we saw Michael Feng debate so much on the block there. I was just thinking, what is the worst thing I could be hit with after this? But ultimately, reason that he couldn't stomach the previous on-hit triggers and is met with the Codex of Frailty, grabbing a drill shot, putting a -1 on that Rampart of the Ram's Head, which I think is just an absolute critical turning point for this
100%.
game for Jake, because we've seen so far how much value Michael Feng has been able to get out of that Rampart of the Ram's Head, particularly because Jake frequently will break the combat chain on these more go-wide turns.
I want to give the Baker a lot of credit here. It's really easy to hit on the top of your deck, find those arrows, dominate them, throw them at your opponent. Even I can do that, smooth brain like myself. What Jake is doing in this game is finding ways to get huge amounts of threats on turn where the Azalea ability is not functioning. Just going ahead and putting together awkward blocks for Michael Feng has now taken the life total lead. Let's see, this is a blind Azalea flip. Do we have a blind hit? It's going to be knock the death whistle instead.
And we see Jake's reaction to that knock the death whistle, maybe not being exactly what he was looking for.
Yeah, and I want to say, I feel like Jake has actually drawn poorly in this game. I think the top of his deck has not been kind to him. There have been opportunities for things to swing in his favor quite dramatically with a little bit of luck. And he's missed thus far, which is scary considering the state we find this game in. A -1 counter on that Rampart, a life total lead for Jake. I think things are going quite well, despite sort of missing here and there.
Yep, I totally agree with you. I think that, Jake, especially in the early game, had some rough turns, was able to pick it up in the mid game. I think we've sort of we've rode that tempo up until this point in the game. Michael Feng finally being back on an arsenal, but paying a hefty life total to get that.
I tried really hard during this shuffle through to count Jake Warburton's deck. I think we're sitting at about 29 cards was my rough count. And, don't take that as gospel. 29 cards, 19 life on the part of Oldham. How are you feeling if you're in Jake's seat? Do you have the resources left to actually go ahead and close out this game?
I think that Jake still has a long road to go, but has run Michael Feng out of critical resources like the staunch responses. Only a few more left in the deck. Has a couple of those 0-4s committed to previous combat chains, now in the graveyard. While 19 life is quite high for Oldham, I do think that Jake is in the driver's seat right now, and is looking to close out this game. I mean, one of the biggest things that Jake was dealing with, I think, throughout a lot of this game was that Rampart of the Ram's Head. I think Michael got over 5 defense value out of that piece of equipment, which is absolutely ridiculous. So, yeah, I mean, it looks like a tougher spot for Michael Feng. Keep in mind, though, that the threat density in Jake's deck is significantly less than when we started this game. So, Michael Feng's still enacting his game plan despite being on, sort of on the losing end of the exchange of the last few turn cycles.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to point out, all that pitch stacking nonsense we talked about in the early game, it's done with. It does not matter anymore. We have shuffled. And, oh no, there's no play here from Jake. That was a disastrous turn in Jake Warburton's seat. No arrow fired, just a complete miss. And look, if you've lived the Ranger life, this is one of the dangers. You can have those off turns where things just fall apart. And if you're Michael Feng, this is your moment. You have to reclaim the game right now. You have an opportunity to claw your way back in, to take that tempo away from Jake, to come after him with on hits, with disruption. And if you're a Michael Feng fan, that was the moment you've been waiting for.
Yeah, Michael Feng with a tunic on 3 as well. Starting to wonder if Michael Feng has potentially sided out the pummels. I mean, I do think that Jake is wondering if the universe is sort of against him with Knock the Death Whistle maybe being the worst card to blind Azalea, and you saw why. Can potentially just end the turn there. But yeah, Michael Feng here, Winter's Bite pitch is going to play the Channel Lake Frigid, which it's a great card for Michael Feng to have in this scenario. We're going to buy him tempo over this turn and potentially the next. We do see Staunch Response pitch, does look like a red one. We got our Command and Conquer.
Perfect turn for Michael Feng. Absolutely perfect. Absolutely what he needed to really reclaim the tempo in this matchup. And actually, in just one moment, I think things have firmly shifted back to Michael Feng in the driver's seat.
Yeah, it does feel like the game sort of exists on a razor's edge, and I think that being in a situation where you do find the knocked decimals and have to simply just pass, and you're met with a channel like Frigid into something like a command and conquer, it's just yeah, it's tough beats for Jake on this turn cycle.
But if you're Jake, you have to shake it off. You have to get back in the kitchen. If you're the baker, start baking some more. Figure out how to reclaim that temple. You've done it before. Jake started this game on the back foot, was able to go ahead and assert himself on the game. He's got to do it again now. Facing down this command and conquer, Channel Lake Frigid at the ready. We know there's going to be decreased output for a few turns. That's dangerous when threat density is decreasing, when cards in deck is decreasing.
Important to keep in mind that Jake does, like we talked about, have the Snapdragon Scaler. So at some point in this game, we'll be able to go quite wide with something like a Rain Razors and have that sort of critical maximum of damage on a single turn to deal a lot of damage to Michael Fang's life total. It does seem like Michael Fang's life does really go down in chunks. I think it was at the beginning of the game we did a little bit of damage, and then 5, 6, 7 turns later we did a little bit of damage. I think that's how it's going to play out towards the end game. Is Jake's going to need to set up, maybe do a couple more big dominated arrows, and then set up for this big Snapdragon Scaler's turn and buy some tempo, or potentially kill Michael Fang.
I think you're exactly right. Jake having to commit a few cards to defense there. Can he put together any threat on this turn? Channel Lake Frigid, brutal for an Azalea player. Skullbone Crosswrap, super expensive. Death Dealer, super expensive. Does have a blue here, pretty critically. Looks like going to go ahead and activate Death Dealer after playing a Lace. Bolton Shot critically put into Arsenal. One more card to pitch. Does something on the turn, preserves some kind of offense, and I think that was pretty critical. And there is some threat on the back of that Lace. I think it is Lace with Inertia. Not 100% sure on that.
The pump card?
Yeah.
I think that is Seek and Destroy.
Oh, okay, thank you. Not a Lace, a Seek and Destroy. So yeah, that is essentially Lace with Inertia. I was 100% correct the entire time. Little bit different wording on Seek and Destroy, but same effect. If it hits a hero, not going to get to keep that arsenal. Going to have to reset their hand. I don't expect it to hit here. I think Michael Fang will find some clean blocks, but the threat is present of the Seek and Destroy.
Yeah, Michael Fang also does have Spinal Crush in hand, we can see.
One thing I want to point out, Brendan, just crossed the 50-minute mark of this match, and we were playing Swiss. This is not an option. You don't get to cross the 50-minute mark. We start talking about draws at this point. One of the things Oldham get access to in these elimination rounds is the ability to play longer game plans. In fact, there are matchups that swing pretty heavily, depending on whether you're playing them in the top 8 or whether you're playing them out here in the Swiss rounds. And I think, something like this sort of pure fatigue plan we're seeing right now from Michael Fang would be a lot harder to do in the Swiss rounds, but here plenty of time to execute. And here we see a big offensive salvo. It is Spinal Crush coming down, looking to take away Go Again from all actions on this next turn. And that does not work well if you're Azalea.
Yeah, Michael Fang realizing that he has the tempo and he can run out something like a Spinal Crush instead of arsenaling a card to have access to something like Crown of Seeds. So we talked about full fatigue, but I think that this is sort of the standard Oldham where, Michael Fang is defending a lot, is trying to survive through Jake's sort of spike turns, but when Michael Fang can turn the corner and start being aggressive, you will see him do what Oldham does best, and it's one of the highest value decks when it comes to actually pumping out some of these attacks, whether it's Spinal Crush, it's Endless Winter by just pitching a single card. I do not think the pummels are actually added in the deck at this point because we've seen most of Michael Fang's deck, but yeah, Michael Fang now on attack, putting pressure onto Jake, and as soon as Jake gets to a low enough life total, every single attack that Michael Fang throws at Jake will take cards from hand and just make Azalea it harder for Azalea to string together the sort of 4 or 5 card hand it might take to get that big dominate attack and close out the game.
Yeah, and it's funny, this card has a big 9 on it. Looks like an offensive card looking to deal damage. It is a fatigue card, though, in a lot of ways. This is going to take 3 cards out of Jake's hand, Jake's deck as well. And, it's sort of a war on two fronts.
Yeah,
You have to worry about what you're giving up on defense if you're Jake Warburton.
the thesis of 2 card 8 and 3 card 10 is somewhat rooted in fatigue, right? If I pitch a single card to come in for 8 damage, if you're going to block out that card, you need to commit 3 actual cards from your deck while I'm committing a single card. 3 card 10 is the same way. It's a single card. I'm pitching 2 cards. It allows me to block, maintain my life total, but then very efficiently come in with these big numbers that you're going to have to trade for with cards from your deck.
And here's another one from Michael Feng. It's Cranial Crush. This, of course, going to prevent drawing cards for Jake Warburton should he take 4 or more from this. That means no Death Dealer. I think what we probably see here is a 2-card block if you're Jake, so get away from that Crush effect. Make sure it's not live, but that means only 2 cards on the next turn, and really desperate to reclaim some purchase in this match is Jake.
Yeah, Michael Feng, I think, rounding the corner quite well as we've thinned Jake from a lot of the threats in his deck. Jake did have the whiff on the knock the death whistle. And now Michael Feng doesn't look like the defensive Ulta deck we've seen for the past 50 minutes.
No, I agree. Has absolutely turned the corner here, and it is going to be a 2-card block by Jake. That means Cranial Crush is not active. Other way to navigate that turn that could have been interesting is just taking some Cranial Crush damage and trying to put together a pumped arrow, not relying as much on Death Dealer, maybe even going as far as Bullseye Bracers. Of course, you would prefer to save that for something like a wide bolt-in shot turn, but I do think it's critical that Jake gets back into this game right now. Has to offer some threat on this turn, and it looks like it is going to be Remorseless, potentially, although we are getting a look at the top card now, and that means Jake is able to consider an Azalea activation. And maybe a dominated on-hit is exactly what Jake needs to go ahead and get back into this game, but it looks like it's going to be a bottom again. And like I said, I don't feel like Jake's top of deck has been all that kind. So many of these ops are just not finding those impressive arrows on top. And you got to feel a little bit for Jake. Has navigated things very well in both good times and bad. But it's been more bad times than good.
Yeah, looking at Jake's deck list, just to circle back around, I think he might be playing every single card in the list, unless he's subbed out just onesies and twosies of some of these 3-ofs, because we've seen one of at least every single card that is represented in this list.
Yeah,
so.
you were 100% correct, Brennan.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So understanding that deck size is a huge resource against something like an Oldhim, for the side of the Azalea player here.
Crown of Seed's going to be activated here. 2 resources floating, critically not dominated Remorseless, as we know. That defense reaction clause.
I think we're going to start seeing those red Glacial Footsteps that were pitched earlier in the game come back around to present a lot of damage to Jake. This one being a blue Glacial Footsteps, but we see the Staunch Response used with the Crown of Sea. It's just a classic combination here for Oldhim.
Perfect block, no arsenal heading into the next turn for Jake. So again, things leaning in Michael's favor. Going to take up that Tunic. And finds a nice Titan's Fist coming through for 4. Knows it's safe. We just saw a Boulder Shot used. Of course, that Rampart always already holding the counter, so it would just be ticking down on that Crater's Fist. And I do want to note Crater's Fist still available. That's a big resource for Michael Feng. That's a huge opportunity to prevent some dominated damage.
Yeah, you'll see top-level players in Flesh and Blood really keep their equipment for the right scenario, never using it early in the game when they might not need to or not to prevent a very critical on-hit effect. And I think this is a great utilization from Crater's Fist. I wish I could remember exactly what Michael Feng told me in terms of how the Oldhim deck plays and specifically when it pivots, because I do think that they have a specific number of turns in mind that is sort of the general heuristic of when the opponent's deck has run out of like a sort of critical minimum of threats to consistently present those big turns, and then Oldhim becomes this aggressive deck and starts fatiguing you by damage rather than by defensive cards.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think in this case the pivot was very much dictated though by Jake's whiff. Like no matter what the overarching plan was, that was going to always be the moment for Michael Feng to seize and go ahead and take the initiative. And he has done so and has not let up since he's taken that back. And if you're Jake, you're desperate to find a way to claw back that tempo to make Michael Feng play without an arsenal for a turn. That would be a huge, huge boon to Jake. And I'm just thinking about how Jake's cards have lined up. Things like the Remorseless effect, like the Release the Tension effect, never really caught Michael with his pants down with a loaded up arsenal with a D-react. And, it just goes back to kind of the story of this match where Azalea, while being powerful, A lot of inherent variance in the deck. There's just a lot of
Mm.
quasi dice rolls where you have to live and die by the top of your deck. And that variant's not going great for Jake thus far. Looking to cheat a little bit this go around with Spire Sniping, taking a look at those top two cards. Can he find an arrow finally to dominate? It's been slow going for Jake to find those dominated arrows. And I think very astutely, Brennan, you picking up on the possibility of every single card in this list being in the deck.
Well, so I got to ask you, Brian, you talk about Azalea being maybe a bit more high variance, having to rely on the top of your deck. Is that somewhat a result of playing that many cards in the list? See, I want to caveat it by saying maybe Jake is not playing all of them, but in terms of the cards represented, which are pretty much all three of us except for the trap, we have seen one of every single card, so I think it'd be reasonable to assume so. Do you think that that increases the variance of the deck and decreases your chance of having those big turns and opens you up to, drawing bad hands like
100%. 100. It's indisputable that it does. Now, does that mean it's an incorrect call? No, I'm not saying that whatsoever. It could be just the threat of fatigue is so massive that if you don't go ahead and play in that fashion, you're just going to be hard punished by Oldhim anyway. And you have to kind of accept that variance. And one of the things great players like Jake will do is understand when you have to accept variance. You can't control everything. And part of being a great TCG player is knowing when to let go and to let the variance gods have some influence over your game and saying, I have to get a little lucky in this spot. There's nothing wrong with that. That's why we play the game with cards, a inherently random thing. If it was chess, it'd be very different. But these are TCGs, man. You have to be willing to accept that sometimes things just aren't going to break your way.
Interesting to see a Sink Below committed to the Ravenous Rabble here. We're not going to see the Rampart of the Ram's Head, which we have seen many times, committed to a go attack like this because of the -1 counter that came from the Drill Shot. Drill Shot just seeming like such a powerful card in this matchup.
Yeah, it's making a difference for sure. It is time to go ahead.
Speaking of Drill Shot.
And activate that Spire Sniping buff and take a card off the top of the deck. It's going to be the Drill Shot, as you mentioned. It is going to have Dominate this go around. Looks like it's not going to pick up the aim counter from the Crow's Nest. Or is it? Reaching for that die? Does Jake want to commit a resource here? Does he believe piercing could be relevant? Yeah, it looks like he is going to go ahead and put that aim counter on, and that means piercing is going to be active on the Drill Shot. Also, things like potentially Deadeye could have further influence over it, but it does look like there isn't going to be any further pumping going on.
Interesting. Does this telegraph a Rain Razors potentially?
It makes me think about it 100%. That's the first card that comes to mind in this scenario, but it doesn't look like it's actually in hand. I believe that's a Codex, and my first read was Premeditate. Yeah, but I mean, there was an option to go ahead and play that Premeditate on this turn in that case.
Maybe realizes that in order to win the game, you can't be attacking with a Drill Shot for 7. You need to instead be stringing together large attacks, right?
I agree.
Going over a critical maximum of 10, because Michael Hamilton, we know, has access to more of the 0 for 4 blocks. Starting to run out of staunch responses, to be honest, but, 0 for 4 going to run nicely into an attack for 7. Do you see Snapdragon Scalers ran out?
Okay, this makes a lot of sense, and now you can go ahead and use that Codex to potentially rebuy an arrow. Combine that with your Premeditate. Seems like a pretty good place to be. It is time now for staunch response on that Drill Shot. Gonna play a little defense.
Yeah, we talked about using Snapdragon Scalers potentially with a card like Rain Razors, but I don't think Jake really has the room to try to set up a turn like that because it is going to be a bit draw dependent with the Bolton shots and being able to have the go again.
No, I like this use a lot, Brendan. We do have the resource floating here. I also want to point out, as you were talking about this sequence of play, you did say Michael Hamilton instead of Michael Feng, which I don't blame you for. I'm so used to seeing Michael Hamilton down in this feature match area. And by the way, our world champion, after a tough start on day one, another one of those 4-3 players, did finish out with the top 32, as of course he would in these circumstances.
Yep, and that's one of Michael Hamilton's worst days at these tournaments, which is pretty incredible.
Yeah.
But Michael Feng also, no stranger to top 8s at these sort of tier 3 and tier 4 events. Always a threat to take down the tournament, and we've kind of seen the very clinical play so far during this matchup.
And this was a really critical decision by Jake. Had some options as to what to go ahead and put in arsenal with that one resource available. Really all the arrows in the deck short of Battering Bolt able to be used. Went with what I believe is a Sedation shot. So trying to get back to that state where Michael Feng does not have an arsenal and Jake does. That's the absolute goal of this turn. However, I want to point out there's some risk with that. What happens if there is a D-React in arsenal? You could have potentially closed that off with something like a Remorseless. But I don't think that's how you get back into this game if you're Jake. I think you have to do exactly this.
And there's the D-React that we spoke about.
Yeah, and it is
Taking
present,
one still, but
still
getting
one
value.
coming through. And
Yeah.
I think that's what's critical here. Certainly, you would have preferred a larger win if you were Jake, but cutting off that arsenal on this next turn means we're getting back to that state where Jake has the potential to take the initiative. My biggest question, are there enough threats left in the deck for Jake to go ahead, seize this initiative, not let it go, and close this game out? Because in a lot of ways, I want to point out, this is even better than the situation Jake found himself in last time he had the initiative, because that Rampart is no longer a threat. So Crown's not a threat, Rampart's not a threat, and that means you can go ahead and maybe set up some of these big dominated arrows. Got to look to get a little bit lucky off the top of the deck and finally find some hits for that Azalea ability.
Looks like maybe Red and the Ledger putting the arsenal for Jake here, but yeah, if there is going to be a window, it seems like this might be it.
A desperate moment for fans of the Baker, hoping he can claw his way back into this game. It's been a back and forth affair.
Michael Feng, having a very healthy life total, I think, in this situation to potentially get himself back on that arsenal and in a safe range. But I think if Jake strings together a series of powerful turns here, could put Michael Feng on the back foot once again.
Yeah, and I don't think we're at that stage where Jake just has like the all blue deck. I think there are powerful threats left for him. However, in this spot, it looks like we're going to the bottom again, and that would have been such a critical spot to find a dominated arrow. Now there's a question, does Jake have to leave things to chance? Do you just have to start blind flipping Azaleas? And all Azaleas reach a point in the game where they have to consider that. It looks instead, though, like we're just going to go ahead and do some face-up pumping. Rain Razors coming down. All arrows this turn going to get +2. Unfortunately, does not have access any longer to something like that Snapdragon Scalers. Is possible we find something like a Bolton shot and can combine here. The second Razor is going to be pitched. Time to load up the arsenal. It is Remorseless being loaded.
Yep.
And draws off the top. And I think it was the third Rain Razors. So dodges a bullet by not going ahead and blind flipping that Azalea.
Yes.
Does have some pumps here.
Read the glide path. This is Deadeye.
Yeah, Deadeye available.
Double Rain Razor pitch, so that's 3 Rain Razors on the bottom of the deck, I believe.
No, one in play right now.
One
two
in
in
play,
the bottom
right?
of the deck.
Yep.
Yeah, there was an opportunity here with that Deadeye and a resource floating. And there's no way of knowing this. It would have been some clairvoyance for sure on the part of Jake. Could have put an aim counter on that Remorseless. And, that's a little weird. Remorseless, of course, does not have an aim counter influenced ability. But Crow's Nest doesn't care about that. It'll put an aim counter on anything. And if that's the case, that turns that Deadeye effect on. I think it's unlikely to matter. I think it's just going to be, are you blocking or not? Are you giving me your whole hand? What's happening here? But just a little point of potential optimization that could have been found on Jake's part. Again, it would have required some prescience you would have had to understand. But you see, had it happened here, you might have left Michael Feng without an arsenal on another turn. Instead, there's just going to be 1 damage coming through.
Michael Feng happy to take that 1 damage in order to get back on that arsenal, utilize Crown of Seeds with Tunic up. Jake definitely in a tough spot. The bottom 5 cards of his deck really not having much gas in them whatsoever. 3 blues and 2 Rain Razors.
Yeah, now when we get to that bottom, it's going to be trouble for Jake. I think this is actually a pretty big miss. And I don't know if I would go as far as to say it's a misplay. I don't think that's necessarily the case. But aim counter on that arrow leaves a very different arena state at this point. If Michael Feng has to answer that as well, maybe the Crater Fish just gets used. But that still matters. Like, that's still a win for Jake Warburton.
The Red and the Ledger. And I believe could be seeing an E-Strike on the top of the deck. Yeah, I'm almost positive that's what it is now.
Continuing to not find arrows off that Skullbone cross wrap. And I think, when Jake replays this matchup in his head, if it doesn't break in his favor, it's going to be some sadness, going to be some bemoaning of variance, and rightly so. Sometimes when players come over and tell you the bad beat story, just like, shut up, I don't want to hear it. It's just what we do. But in Jake's case, I think there's something to be said for just a really unfortunate string of reveals to that Skullbone cross wrap.
There's the E-Strike we talked about. Coming into the arsenal here for Jake, so it's going to be a Red in the Ledger that goes onto the bottom of the deck. I think we're getting close to the point where if you counted the attack value of all the cards left in Jake's deck, it might not equal 17.
Yeah, and Michael Feng knows that. He knows that the threat density is rapidly decreasing. There's increasingly less influence Jake is able to have over this match as this game goes on. The threat of that 14 damage arrow with Dominate just starting to evaporate for Jake. We also know plenty of staunch responses left, plenty of ways to deal damage. That Titan's Fist going to become a bigger part of the game plan as we move throughout. Things are getting very, very hard for Jake Warburton now.
Yeah, I think Michael Feng currently sees his way to win this game. Is a bit light on staunch responses now, I believe. But honestly, with access to this Crown of Seeds and that tunic available to get that card off that singular resource, if Michael Feng does have the arsenal, puts him in a really good spot to defend out a lot of Jake's attacks. Unless we see a massive dominated arrow, which I honestly don't think is going to be the case. Lace with Blood Rot is a good place to start. Going into Seek and Destroy.
Yeah, and an inertia arrow. So a threatening arrow, to be sure. One that can, again, reclaim that arsenal advantage. In this case, Michael Feng does have the ability to get that increased card in hand, activating Crown of Seeds, so a prevention shield, and I believe 3 cards in hand. So that represents probably 10 prevention. Possibility of a damage leaking here.
Nope. We see the equipment used expertly here by Michael Feng, saving them for the end game. And there goes the Old Him Earth React, preventing 2 damage.
Yeah, and that equals 11. No on hit here. I will say mission accomplished. There's not going to be an arsenal on this turn.
Yeah, absolutely mission accomplished here, I think, for Michael Feng. Likely getting to the point in Jake's deck where I think we have it fully mapped, being 3 blues, 2 rain razors, 1 red in the ledger, 1 unknown card that was tucked with E-Strike, and then a red sedation shot.
Yeah, that's not a winning combo, I hear, Brennan. And I think Jake starting to realize that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 question mark. Either 4 or 5 cards left in deck alongside Jake's hand, and man, it doesn't feel like there's 17 there. It's just even if Michael Feng were to step away from the table and say no blocks for the rest of the game, it's becoming challenging for Jake to win.
Yep, and the 2 rain razors really kind of being dead in this scenario. With there being no Snapdragons and just, yeah, not a lot of access to Gogan here. And I don't think that Michael was going to get got by any Rain Razor play. Also, being a 17 life, it's not much of a threat.
And just expertly navigated by Michael Feng thus far. There were windows for Jake the Baker.
Absolutely. I
Let's
think
not
that
forget about
before
it.
that knocked the death whistle, I
Yep.
thought that Jake the Baker was in control and was going to get Michael down to a much lower life total where we could have seen him set up a pitch stack to potentially dominate Narrow and close out the game. It was honestly looking a little bit bad for Michael Feng.
I agree. I thought Jake was firmly in the driver's seat. I thought we were headed to that fabled Azalea eating up all the Lexis. It seemed like a very real possibility, but unfortunately doomed by an untimely knock the death whistle off the top and a turn which just produced nothing. And for members of the Azalea cult, it's an all too familiar story. You've lived through it with Rangers too many times. You know there is just a moment sometimes in these games as both Azalea and Lexi where your deck kind of gives up on you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the price you pay for those supremely powerful turns that you get in other moments. But it is a real price, and it seems to be one that has had an extremely deterministic effect on Jake's prospects to go ahead and get Azalea those first living legend points to become a Pro Tour champion here in Baltimore.
Going to see a Death Dealer draw with the Bolton shot pitch. I believe that's the first card of the sequence that I have currently tracked. Battering Bolt. I believe that might be a blue arrow that was drawn.
And Jake not going to give up. Going to look for any chance. Fall back into this game as champions do.
The namesake card, looking at this now 3-card deck. 4-card deck. I believe there's a red in the ledger and a red sedation shot there.
Yep. Please put these 3 cards into a random order, Michael Feng. Thank you.
Michael Feng, a little smile there as well.
Yeah, Azalea is going to be activated. That means we are going to see a dominated arrow here. I wonder what it'll be. Shocking. Station shot. Crow's Nest going to power that up a bit. Still a resource floating here for Jake. This does have Dominate. And it is just going to be fired off without any additional embellishment. I think what Jake is looking for is just like, can I dominate a 6-power arrow on 5 turns in a row, 6 turns in a row, and just leak through that 3, catch you with no defense reactions. But I think even that first staunch response dooms this plan.
Met with the last staunch
Yeah, and
response
that
in
is
deck,
going to
and
get the
there you
fist
go.
bump, and that's exactly what Jake was playing toward. And you see Michael Feng, surgical